Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and I'm going to be doing another video on Wargame Red Dragon for the wargamer.com. Now in our previous video we actually discussed the origins of the Korean War, a little bit more so than I probably had intended, and then we had also talked about the initial phases of the Korean War, where the North threw the South into the southeast corner of Korea, into an area known as the Pusan Perimeter, and then at the very end of that video I did mention the plan of North Korea, the plan of General Douglas Macarthur, commander of the UN forces, who we had discussed how the UN became a member in the conflict, had devised a plan to land forces in the rear of the North Korean forces in order to cut them off and to accelerate a counteroffensive out of Pusan. What we hadn't yet discussed was the state of the action, or of the fighting in Pusan, other than a brief mention of some carpet bombing which occurred, and the actual state of the North Korean forces, as well as the way that the Battle of Incheon came to be, and then, of course, the Battle of Incheon itself. All of these are topics which I wish to discuss in this video. This one's going to be a little bit longer than the previous videos, probably around 40 minutes, maybe a little bit longer than that. But essentially, in this video, we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video, talking about the invasion of South Korea by the North and the Battle of Pusan. We had talked about the North forcing the South into the Pusan perimeter, but what happened from that point on, and how did the tide of the war turn, and maybe how was the Battle of Incheon not actually the turning point, and then the actual, planning for the Battle of Incheon, the eventual invasion at the Battle of Incheon, and then the subsequent result of the Battle of Incheon as the war turned its course and the North was driven out of South Korea and chased back into North Korea itself. And maybe if we have some time we'll get into the consequences of that, although I don't imagine we'll quite have enough time for all of that. Still, there will be several more parts to this series, so if you are interested in learning a little bit about the Korean War, while also watching me reenact everything I'm discussing here on the screen using Wargame Red Dragon and the Pusan Perimeter campaign. It's a single-player campaign, which is occurring here on the screen. In the last video, we did land at Incheon. We also held off enemy assaults against Pusan, although by no means is Pusan safe, as North Korea certainly has several provinces under their control, and we have not yet secured Incheon either. So as we play through these events, and as we play through this game and kind of recreate the historical events, hopefully for our sake, given the fact that the South was successful, at least in what we're attempting to do here in this video. If you have any questions, please throw those in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. I try and get to every comment that is posted, and if there's anything you'd like to see, please let me know. But anyway, without much further ado, let's go ahead and get back into the discussion. And first of all, where were we? Well, it was August of 1950. North Korea had launched an offensive into South Korea, driven the South Korean forces and American forces and UN forces all the way back into the Pusan perimeter, and it was mid-August at this point in time. So what happened from there on out? Well, that's going to be the discussion of this video. So without further ado, let's get started. While UN forces were in place around the Pusan perimeter by early August of 1950, it wasn't technically until August 4th of 1950 that the Battle of Pusan, the Pusan perimeter, began. While it may seem to imply, given the fact that it's called the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, that it was a continuous action amongst single forces, the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter was more accurately described as a campaign as opposed to an actual military engagement. Allied forces had formed themselves up in this perimeter on the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula, and actually the battle, despite the defeats by Allied forces and UN forces in the preceding weeks, the initial engagements in the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter were actually offensive actions. The United States launched an offensive with, I believe it was the 24th Infantry Division, against North Korean troops that they believed were basically priming for an attack. So it was a preemptive strike against these North Korean troops to hit them before they were able to get into their positions and launch their attacks. Now, the Koreans were a little bit caught by surprise with this, and several of their units were actually attacking while the U.S. forces were attacking, and there were meeting engagements, and there was fierce fighting. This was the first wide-scale attack or counterattack by UN or US forces, or Korean forces for that matter, since the war had begun. And it spelled some concern for the Koreans, who, while advancing dramatically, were now in a very different position than they were previously to this offensive, in that up until this point, the North Koreans had basically been able to conduct double envelopments, launching frontal attacks with a part of their force and the other portions going around the enemy's flanks, causing the line to cave in and forcing them to retreat or risk being destroyed, as several units were. With the Pusan Perimeter, however, it was now impossible for the Koreans to get around the flanks of the UN forces without at least breaking through their center, something they had not had a whole lot of success to this point doing. And the early counteroffensive by UN forces did help to disorganize Korean forces around Masana, I believe it was called, which was one of the key points of the Pusan Perimeter. Now, the initial phases of the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter were very fractionalized. There were several, and I don't know if that's a word, but they were very disorganized in the sense that individual Korean divisions would attack and then would be counterattacked. Sometimes they would have success. It was around the Battle of, well, let's see, there's a whole bunch of battles included in the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, all through just the month of August. From August 4th until the end of the month. There was fighting around Masan. There was a battle called Battle Mountain, the First Nang Tong Bulge, the Puan Puang Dong, the Battle of Tagu, and the Battle of Bowling Alley. There were numerous times where Korean forces would break through UN lines only to be unable to exploit their advantages thanks to heavy air cover provided by UN forces. In many cases, the good old F-4U Corsair of World War II fame was brought in not in an air-to-air role, but in a close air support role, dropping napalm and weapons on Korean forces. North Korean troops were at the end of a long, extended supply line, and they lacked sufficient transport to get the supplies they needed to maintain a consistent push, and often attacks would break down due to logistical problems as well, whereas the UN forces had a virtually non-existent supply line in that it was incredibly short. Their supply line back to Pusan was incredibly close, and the Allies had a phenomenal supply system and total control of the seas, which allowed them to flood the port of Pusan with countless reinforcements and reserves and basically, everything they needed. So despite several successful attempts, be it at Tagu or Masana or Bowling Alley or the Battle of Battle Mountain, despite several periods where the North Koreans would break through the lines, and at one point, I believe it was at Tagu, the North Koreans actually had a clear road to Pusan at one point in time. They lacked the firepower, they lacked the technology, they lacked the logistics to be able to follow up on those successes. And unlike previous engagements where they were able to completely outflank and double envelop the enemy, good interior and short interior lines by by UN forces allowed the North Koreans to be successful, but not too successful, basically stymieing the North Koreans at every possible turn. Meanwhile, each time the Koreans attacked, they used up precious supplies, precious fuel, and more importantly, precious manpower. Casualties began to mount in the north. They had already been mounting since the initial phases of the war. And frankly, with a country that relies heavily on frontal assaults and envelopments and was used to very heavy casualties, fighting an enemy with no flanks to envelop was a recipe for disaster. It was frontal attack after frontal attack into the teeth of heavy artillery fire and heavy air support. And while some attacks met with success and the Allies certainly lost their fair share of men, the attacks were not terribly successful in the end, and the battle began to turn almost immediately. By September, it became clear to the North Koreans that these isolated attacks in individual cities, even in times when there were 3 or 4 simultaneous divisions attacking against the enemy, was not something that was going to bode well for the Koreans. These battles were incredibly costly, as I said. The Battle of Masan cost the North Koreans over 11,000 soldiers killed just there and another 3,000 captured, versus just about 1,000 U.S. casualties killed, another 3,000 wounded. The Battle of Battle Mountain was another bloody fight in which the North Koreans lost over 8,000 killed to just 400 American casualties. The first Battle of Nangkong Bulge, only about 1,200 North Korean losses to 600 American losses, so that fight was more even but it certainly wasn't, in their favor to continue fighting these types of battles, and being continually hurt. There was one period of time at the Battle of Podang where U.S. forces were forced to retreat and pull back closer in toward Pusan. It was one of the times where the North had a clear road open to Pusan, but lack of supplies and reinforcements prevented their success. The Battle of Taegu was another example of heavy losses, about 200 Americans killed versus over 3,700 North Koreans. You can see the list goes on. The Battle of Bowling Alley was another good example of over 5,600 North Korean casualties. They did inflict about 2,300 on these South Koreans. So with a lack of logistics, limited resupply, limited reinforcements, and continually launching frontal assaults and losing heavy casualties, it was a recipe for disaster for the North, and eventually they had to call off the attacks. The North basically started off in a pretty strong position in early August, but their attacks grew weaker and weaker as the fighting went on, and by the end of the month, they knew they had to change what they were doing. They knew they had to reorganize and try for one last push in order to try and basically throw the UN forces into the sea. By this point, it was probably too late. Large-scale reinforcements into the Pusan perimeter actually ensured that the North was outnumbered, despite being on the offensive. The North decided to launch one more massive assault, and this one was going to be a coordinated one, a assault along the entire Pusan perimeter. They called it the Nangtong Offensive. Took place from September 1st until September 15th, and it was the North Koreans' final and unsuccessful attempt to break the Pusan perimeter. The North Korean army planned a simultaneous offensive for their entire army. There were 5 axes of advance, and there was intense fighting which erupted around all these cities which we had already mentioned: Masan, Kunjo, Tagao, Yuchong, and the Nangkong Bulge. There was 2 weeks of incredibly brutal fighting. Both sides attempted to defeat the other, and while the North Korean offensive was initially successful in some places, they were unable to hold their gains against a now numerically superior UN force, and far technologically superior as well as logistically superior. The North Korean army was basically held back by the thinnest of margins, if you will, thanks in large part to superior firepower. One must wonder, however, that even if the North Koreans broke through the Pusan perimeter and drove in on Pusan itself, a naval gunfire may have been too much to overcome, although it's hard to say what the tactical situation would be and if the UN forces may have still had to have withdrawn. I'm not certain. The terrain certainly doesn't favor naval bombardment when you've got huge mountains and lots of heavy terrain, which makes it harder for indirect fire, I would imagine. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert on indirect fire, but when you've got multiple peaks and stuff, and the shell's got to go up and over basically like a howitzer, I can't imagine it's quite as easy, at the very least, to bring in offensive naval gunfire. Nonetheless, the Great Nangkong Offensive failed, and the North was stopped cold, now low on supplies, low on morale, and heavily outnumbered. The days of the North Korean control of the bulk of South Korea were numbered, as more and more UN forces continued to pour into the region. It was at this point that the U.S. forces were launching an invasion in the rear of the North Korean troops, and that's where we finally get, after some 40 minutes of discussion, it's where we finally get to talk about the Battle of Incheon, the bold stroke of Macarthur, and kind of how that offensive shaped up. Because while the North was being defeated in front of the Pusan perimeter, it would have been a tough fight to drive the North back with frontal assaults of their own by UN forces to break out of Pusan all by themselves and to try and push back and take back all of Korea. Would have been a slow slugfest. And the American military, namely Douglas MacArthur, had already planned out the way in which they intended to drive the North back and hopefully bag a large number of North Korean prisoners and destroy the North Korean army as an effective fighting force. That was the Battle of Incheon. The landings at Incheon may have happened much sooner if General Macarthur had had his way. Initially, when the attack began in late June of 1950, General Macarthur had very little faith in South Korean military forces' ability to withdraw or defend against the North. In fact, just days after the war began, the capital of Seoul, which is near the northern border of South Korea, fell, and by that point in time, General Macarthur, who was commander of all UN forces, a five-star general and a World War II hero from the Pacific Theater, was already envisioning an amphibious assault. Macarthur, perhaps better than anyone in this time, may have been well qualified to lead a bold maneuver behind enemy lines, as it matched many of the World War II tactics. I wonder if another general who maybe had fought more in Europe would have been as willing to launch a large-scale amphibious assault rather than focus on ground assaults, but MacArthur certainly was, as his ability to hop through the islands in the Pacific was a very successful strategy for the United States, avoiding many of Japan's incredibly strongly built-up islands during World War II. A similar operation was being planned for Incheon, although I think it might be more accurate to label it something along the lines of the Battle of Anzio in Europe, where the United States landed a large army behind enemy lines in an attempt to get around heavily defensed positions. The principle was the same in either case at the Battle of Incheon, in that the United States would land a large force behind enemy lines, threaten them with being cut off, and force them to withdraw from the Pusan Perimeter all the way north, and perhaps even surround and destroy the entire North Korean army. Whatever the eventual result, however, an initial plan was put into place, codenamed Operation Blue Hearts. It was originally planned for July 22nd. Less than a month after the war had began, the United States was already planning a large-scale amphibious assault, which would have been led by the 1st United States Cavalry Division. It was set to take place in Incheon. However, just a couple of days after the plan was put together, the operation was scrubbed, as the North Korean advances and successes were making it clear that the division would be needed to help hold the line at the Pusan Perimeter. That's one thing that you have to credit the North Koreans with during this war, is that their offensives were so successful and so devastating to the Allied forces in the early days of the war that many forces which were planned to be used against them in counterattacks could not be used because they had to plug the gap. Essentially, for the first 2 months of the war, almost all reinforcements that were being brought into theater had to be raced into the Pusan Perimeter as quickly as possible to hold off the various offensives which we had just been talking about. Another operation was planned named Operation Cromarty, and that was going to be an amphibious assault taking place at Incheon. It was going to be led by the 2nd United States Infantry Division and the United States 5th Marine Regiment. However, and that was to take place in mid-September. However, this operation also fell through, as the 2nd Infantry Division and the Marines were also moved into the Pusan Perimeter. Again, an example of how desperate the situation really was. Despite looking back at it and saying, yeah, the Pusan Perimeter was never all that close to falling, you can certainly make that argument, but a big case of that occurring and a big case of the UN forces eventually outnumbering the North was the continual shifting of reinforcements from other theaters into the Pusan Perimeter, rushing as many troops as possible in to try and shore up the lines. Instead, a new plan was scheduled where the U.S. 7th Army Division would be used in the invasion of Incheon. And that was the very last U.S. Army Division, the 7th Infantry Division, the last reserve unit in East Asia, would be the unit which was decided to take place in Operation Cromarty. So after more than 2 infantry divisions and a Marine regiment had been stripped from the initial plans, they went ahead with the plans for the 7th U.S. Infantry Division to land at Incheon. Now, Incheon is a port city which is close to the capital of Seoul on the west coast of Korea, up near the 38th parallel, a little bit south of it. And Incheon was chosen, one, because of its proximity to Seoul, which was a major rail and road network, which seizing would seriously threaten supply lines to the south for the north. Obviously, also retaking the capital of South Korea would be a huge morale boost to the soldiers, both the Koreans and the Americans, striking a devastating blow logistically and morally. I don't think that's a word. Devastating blow to the morale of the North Korean forces as well. Now, the operation was planned for September. Again, the operation began being planned as early as July of 1950, just a couple weeks after the war started, but it was to take place in September. by which point in time most of the North Korean offensives were either grinding to a halt or about to finish after serious defeats. So one could make the argument that the Battle of Pusan had already turned the tide against the North, and that the invasions at Incheon merely sped the inevitable result. But it's possible it could have saved a large number of lives, as it certainly prevented the forces in the Pusan perimeter from having to launch frontal attacks against troops in good defensive terrain, rather going around them and conducting an end-round landing all the way north near Incheon, near Seoul. It's also important to note that there were several other locations which were considered over Incheon. One of these was the city of Jomyeong, which was essentially the eastern sister city to Incheon. It was a port city on the east coast of South Korea. It might have been closer to Japan, so in that sense it might have been easier logistically. The port, however, wasn't as high a quality, and it didn't have the proximity to Seoul, the South Korean capital, that Incheon did, so there wouldn't be that morale boost by landing there. Also, the city wasn't as important in terms of logistics and supplies because it wasn't a major rail hub in the way that Seoul was. So taking the city in of itself didn't threaten the supplies all the way south to the North Korean forces fighting near Pusan. So there were a lot of negatives against it, but it was a considered location. Another one of the locations which was considered was not something that was quite as bold or adventurous. It was the city of Kusan, which is a southwestern port, or I guess central western port city in Korea. There's actually a U.S. Air Force base there, Kusan Air Base. It's one of the major air bases in Korea, in which U.S. forces are still stationed there today, defending against a North Korean potential attack, which hopefully will never come. But Kusan was another one of the cities which was considered. Again, it's just upstream from the Yellow Sea. It's served by railroad traffic along the Gusan line, and it is a major air base, and also today is a free trade zone. But essentially, the reason that this location was not decided upon was it wasn't quite as adventurous. It's on the western coast like Incheon, but it's further south, so taking the city while threatening the rear of the North Korean troops did not have a huge morale boost. It did not have a huge logistical boost, and it would have possibly been less effective because being further south, it would have given the North Korean troops around Pusan the ability potentially to shift reinforcements there without really risking being cut off. And if the UN did make a serious threat to cut those forces off, they would have plenty of time to withdraw and most of the logistical network in place. So Incheon was the most profitable location to land soldiers at, but it was not the easiest. Incheon was a port city which was difficult to get to during certain tides. There was an island and several fortresses nearby, and it was somewhat heavily defended, being near the capital of Seoul. It was the logical, if not difficult, location to launch an attack against, and there was considerable risk because only during certain times of the day could the Navy's larger warships get in to provide close gunfire support. So there were times where the fleet, which was launching the invasion, would essentially be cut off from the soldiers who were landing at Incheon, and it really made the whole situation somewhat dicey and very risky for Macarthur to land forces there. Nonetheless, General Macarthur was never one to shy away from a risk, and he did decide to go ahead with the invasion at Incheon, which led to the mid-September battle at the Battle of Incheon, which was, if not the turning point as we discussed earlier, thanks in large part perhaps to the turning point occurring at the Battle of Pusan, then it was the death knell in the North Korean army and their ability to fight a coherent defense after their failure to overwhelm the Pusan Perimeter. On September 10th of 1950, the initial bombardments after a serious period of preparation began against Incheon. The United States and UN forces were worried about a potential trap in the sense that there was a North Korean spy ring which had been broken up in Japan, and supposedly the plans for Operation Cromartie, the invasion at Incheon, had been discovered by the North by one of their spies, and it was unclear on whether that spy had been able to transmit his information to the North before his capture. As it turns out, the North were not expecting an attack at Incheon, and when the bombardment began with bombing strikes from U.S. carrier groups offshore and cruisers and destroyers, the area was lightly defended. The defender of the forces there, however, assured his leadership in Pyongyang that the North Korean forces would hold out against any American assault against his position, and actually gave a good account of himself initially. The channel that the Allied forces had to move up was very shallow. There was risk of mines. The maneuverability was constrained, and there were several lighter forts of shore guns that were opposing the Allied forces. Of the initial fleet of, I think it was about 5 destroyers moved up the channel, and 3 of them were heavily damaged, although they also did do serious damage to the defending batteries. Bombardment continued from September 5th all the way through till September 15th, steadily reducing the fort's ability to defend the area. And on September 15th, the bombardment, which stopped, made way for the landings at Incheon. There were several different beaches which took place, or which were landed at. The Blue Beach, Red Beach, and Green Beach, all of which were successfully taken, and there was limited casualties in the entire operation, in the entire landings. There was some, but not a ton. There was actually an air attack by the North that was made against the USS Rochester, which was a cruiser. A North Korean Yak-9 and IL-2 made an attack run on the Rochester while she was anchored during the operation off of Walmy-do. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Initially, the aircraft were thought to be friendly until they ended up dropping bombs over the American ships. All of the bombs except for one missed, and the one that did hit Rochester dented a crane, but it failed to detonate. There were no casualties, and there was a Purple Heart that was painted on the crane afterwards, apparently. The North Korean IL-2 then proceeded to strafe a British cruiser, resulting in 1 killed, 2 wounded. So one of the rare times that the North would launch air attacks against American vessels at war, or British vessels at war, or just basically UN vessels at war at sea. So the landings went off largely without a hitch, despite the concerns and the restricted harbor. If the North had done a better job of preparing, it might have been a different story, but thankfully it was not. Unfortunately, the largest losers in the campaign were, as many times in warfare, civilians. Hundreds of civilians were killed in the bombardments and bombing runs on Incheon against what were North Korean military targets, but inevitably, when military targets are in a city, you definitely risk civilian casualties, and there was a fair number of casualties there. The resistance at Incheon itself was extinguished nearly immediately. Supplies began to flow ashore. U.S. Navy Seabees began to move ashore, and underwater demolition teams arrived as well, constructing decks, clearing debris from the water, and making port facilities able to be used by United States LSTs. Supposedly, according to some documents which were written by Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, that shortly after the United Nations troops landed at Incheon, he made the statement that the original plan of the war was to end it in a month. He didn't think they could stamp out 4 American divisions all by themselves, and that they were taken by surprise when United Nations troops and American Air Force and Navy troops moved in to begin supporting South Korea. Basically a statement of regret of launching the invasion of South Korea, in that they underestimated the United States' will to intervene, as well as the rest of the world's will to intervene. Now, as we had said previously, the North Koreans were somewhat unlucky in the UN becoming involved, because the only reason that was possible was because the Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations for a period of time due to certain political issues that were going on. Some other issues, I believe in Europe, was causing the Soviet Union to boycott the General Assembly. So a UN intervention in Korea would have been impossible if the Soviet Unions had been there, because they simply could have vetoed the proposal and it never would have happened. At the time, I do not believe China had a seat, or actually what may have been the situation is because China was in the midst of a civil war. The Chinese government might have still been recognized as the nationalists who were in Taiwan, whereas the Communist Party of Mao was not yet granted a seat on the General Assembly, so the Chinese couldn't veto either. Either way, the invasion at Incheon was a dramatic success. Just a day later, the North Koreans rushed 6 columns of T-34 tanks to the beachheads, basically to try and launch a counterattack. But they were completely alone, without any infantry support, and American air power ended up negating a large column of those troops. Basically, the carriers offshore helped limit any counteroffensives, and very quickly Kimpo Airfield, which was nearby, was recaptured. It was the largest and most important airport in all of Korea, so it now gave the United States a land base, other than just the sea-based carriers, to bring in even more air support. In contrast to the quick victory at Incheon, however, the Battle of Seoul was slow and bloody. The North Koreans launched several counterattacks and ended up getting destroyed in many cases, but they delayed the invasion. It was the second Battle of Seoul. The first Battle of Seoul was relatively quick. The North took the city quickly. The second Battle of Seoul was another quick battle. It only lasted 4 days, but the North Koreans were outnumbered more than 5-1, and they did put up a fierce fight. There was city fighting. It was a difficult engagement, but the North was simply outnumbered too extensively. At the same time as all of this was going on September 15th, the UN forces in the Pusan Perimeter launched a counterattack and broke out of the Pusan Perimeter, and leading to a general withdrawal by North Korean forces throughout all of Korea in the Pusan Perimeter, as well as in the, I guess you could call it the Inchon Perimeter. There are historians out there who make the argument that Incheon was one of the most decisive battles in military history, but as far as the landing itself, while it was certainly a phenomenal feat, you have to consider the fact that the United States was a country which was probably at this time the most experienced in terms of amphibious assaults in the history of warfare. The commander, I forgot his name, who was commanding the actual landing, took part in both Leyte Gulf and D-Day. And the United States, just a few years prior, had made landing in, amphibious landings basically in their sleep. The advance on Seoul out of Incheon was slow. It was not rapid, and it did allow a large portion of the North Korean forces, which were around Pusan, to escape. It kind of counters the results of Normandy, when the U.S. created a large pocket in Falaise and ended up surrounding a large number of German troops. There was no immediate and energized and vigorous assault after Seoul, and while the North Koreans were certainly defeated and pushed back, a large percentage of their army would escape to the north. This ended up leading into a period of time in which there was some indecision as the United States and UN forces began to mop up in South Korea about what to do. General Macarthur and other military officers wanted to disregard some warnings which had been becoming from China and advance into North Korea to once and for all end the threat of North Korea. While there was some hesitation initially in Washington, Truman and others ended up bowing to the general's wishes and invading into North Korea. The invasion was initially successful, and by Thanksgiving in 1950, there was virtually no territory left in North Korea that was not in United Nations hands, but the advance was rash. It was way beyond the lines of supply. Flanks were not kept guarded, and the UN forces found themselves in the same position they were in early 1950 when they were attacked by a numerically superior force with strategic surprise and with open flanks, allowing them to be rolled back and thrown back. And this ended up happening when the Chinese launched a massive offensive of over 250,000 soldiers into North Korea to prevent the fall of the North. China did not want a U.S. state which they viewed as a puppet on their border that was considered a serious threat to national security, and some of the U.S. generals' statements about using nuclear weapons or even possibly carrying the invasion into China were also somewhat alarming to the Chinese. Understandably so. Mao Zedong, the leader of China, had only been in control of China for about 2 years. He had just defeated the nationalists who had controlled China for something like 20 or 30 years before that, and the Chinese Civil War was finally over, and now all of a sudden you've got a country which has supported your opponent throughout the Civil War in the nationalists on your doorstep and talking about possibly invading. So the North was aided by China, which ended up deploying even more forces than the North Koreans had available to them. Over 1 million Chinese soldiers were deployed to the theater. The United States and UN forces were thrown back with terrible losses throughout the winter of 1950, thrown back past the 38th parallel, past Seoul, and ended up being really driven back and put into a serious jeopardy for a time. The United States ended up regaining the offensive and counterattacking the Chinese invasion, and another battle in December of 1950 after a 2-month retreat. In December of I'm jumping ahead of myself. In December of 1950, the Chinese, in the midst of their counteroffensive, ended up taking the city of Seoul again from the UN forces, and capturing a large number of troops, although there were a fair number of troops who were able to escape, and there were strategic elements that the Chinese failed in, but they did retake Seoul. So the Third Battle of Seoul was a Chinese victory, really, in the winter of 1950, probably the lowest point of the war. But shortly thereafter, the UN forces began to regroup and began to prepare for counteroffensives, and there ended up being further battles in Seoul. I think there ended up being 5 battles in Seoul. In the end, the Korean conflict would end with a stalemate. Basically, after the Chinese offensive caught the United Nations forces by surprise, they would end up launching a counteroffensive of their own with superior air forces. The United States and UN forces would end up crippling Chinese supplies, crippling the ability to supply the vast army which the Chinese had sent south into North Korea, and crippling the North's ability to wage a war with long and extended supply lines. It seems that the war in Korea can kind of be expressed by whoever's closer to the supply lines wins. When the North was throwing the South all the way back into the corner, their supply lines got shorter, and air superiority by the Allies allowed them to pick apart the North Korean supply line and counterattack. When the North Koreans were pushed back and the UN forces had long, extended supply lines, the Chinese launched surprise attacks with secure supply lines out of China, which could not be bombed for fear of expanding the war beyond the Korean peninsula and possibly making it nuclear, as General Macarthur actually had suggested multiple times. The Chinese drove the Allies back. As the Chinese supply lines became extended and vulnerable to air attack, the Allied air superiority once again turned the tide, and the counteroffensive by ground forces pushed the Chinese back. And all this back and forth fighting was very reminiscent in the tactics and the results of World War II fighting. But it was at this point in early 1951 that things began to change. The lines began to stabilize north of the 38th parallel. And what you ended up seeing was the Korean War shifting from a mobile World War II style conflict into a static World War I style conflict with trenches, large-scale offensives with limited results, and then eventually for about 2 years on and off peace talks, which struggled to come to a satisfactory result for both sides. The war probably would have ended sooner if the issue of prisoners of war and exchanges hadn't come up, where a large number of North Korean and Chinese prisoners did not want to return to their respective countries, resulting in the United States being basically unsure of exactly how to negotiate for the return of those soldiers when they wanted their own back. But how do you send someone who doesn't want to go back to a tyrannical government in North Korea, for example? How do you force them back to their homeland when they don't want to go? So all in all, that's kind of a quick summary of the Korean War. Really, the war, while lasting from 1950 to 1953 and largely being called the Forgotten War today, the rapid mobile operations ceased by early 1951, and from early 1951 through 1953, a slow, methodical ground campaign developed with both sides just attempting to gain small footholds and success in order to better their position at the bargaining table in the peace talks. In that sense, it was very similar to the later years in the Vietnam War with regards to United States military involvement, in that forces were still fighting and dying, but both sides had kind of given up winning, at least at the the meantime. The North Vietnamese certainly didn't give up on winning, but they weren't going to try and overthrow the South while U.S. military forces were still fighting on the ground. The Easter Offensive occurred largely as a result of most U.S. combat ground forces being withdrawn and only air forces being around, and even from then, there were about 2 more years again till the next serious push by the North in the eventual destruction of South Vietnam. Similarly, there were several large offensives which were incredibly bloody and static in terms of movement, which did occur, but the last several years of the war, while tragic and bloody and certainly full of heroism and tragedy, as I've already said, was void of dramatic victories and dramatic military maneuvers, and in that sense, sort of the history book storytelling of Korea kind of ended in early 1951. It doesn't usually get a whole lot of play beyond the counteroffensive to kind of stop and finally retake Seoul, and then things just kind of slowly peter out in terms of popularity, at the very least, rightly or wrongly. Now, in terms of this video here and my video series for Wargame Red Dragon, I'm in the midst of a battle here in Pusan, I believe it is, in the south, while I've taken Incheon in the north, but I've taken far too many heavy casualties. Pusan will not fall. I've inflicted incredibly heavy casualties on the north, in that I should be able to hold relatively easily Pusan without having it fall, and that in of itself will assure me a minor victory or draw at worst. But with the successful landing at Incheon, I've ensured myself a minor victory. That's to be said, it's pretty close to what happened in terms of actual history, where the United States launched a dramatic invasion of Incheon, took it, and then kind of got sluggish and failed to follow up on it to the maximum extent that it could have. And that's kind of the spot I fall into. Now, a minor victory in this campaign, which is what I will end up getting because I've just taken too many heavy casualties to effectively drive across the peninsula and cut off the north, will ensure a victory for the South, and that they will survive and retake their territory. But North Korea will not be permanently defeated. And in that sense, I have failed to change the strategic situation on the Korean peninsula. As we can see here, me fighting out this battle here near Pusan. Now, this is part 5, I believe, of my Wargame Red Dragon series, and I think that's going to about wrap it up. You know, I said I could certainly do more videos to kind of show the resulting campaign, but at this point, with the casualties that the U.S. forces have taken, we've just lost too many infantry. They'd be very repetitive battles in which I'd be deploying with heavy armor units, getting defeated, and then not having the money and resources to counterattack and take the territories I need. I've got enough to hold on to the territory that I've taken. I don't have enough to close the gap and cross the peninsula, and because of that, I will not win a major victory, and because of that, I don't think I'm going to continue the series beyond this part, mainly because I think it would get a little bit boring, just watching the same sort of static fighting without any real hope of dramatic victory. So in that sense, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the series up here at episode 5. I hope you enjoyed the series. It was a lot of fun for me. I mean, the first several episodes were kind of talking about Wargame Red Dragon, which I now have a review up on the wargamer.com. So if this is a game that, me playing through it interests you, check out the review, because I kind of go into more depth about the game than I did in any of these videos. I talk a lot more about certain strengths and weaknesses, how it's different from Wargame Airland Battle, and maybe how it's not different than Wargame Airland Battle, and kind of cover a lot of those types of topics. So, if these videos interested you, please check the review out. It's at wargamer.com. I'm sure it'll be up near the homepage, and if it's not, you can go through their search bar and just type Wargame Airland or Wargame Red Dragon review. I did an Airland Battle review as well. Here's a hint: the games are very similar. The one thing I didn't really show in this, I showed some amphibious assaults. I didn't show any naval engagements. If any of those were going to be coming up later on, I would probably keep recording this series just to show those. In summation, the naval engagements get dull pretty quick. They're exciting from a visual standpoint, but they're very unrealistic. Rockets, missiles act like rockets in that they seem to be straight shot. The engagements seem to take place at 5 feet, or at least in the ground engagements, it seems like things are spread out pretty well so that it doesn't feel like you're too congested. Naval just seems to be an attempt to transplant land combat and put it in the sea. With dramatically shortened weapon ranges, less accurate weapons, and just kind of, it seems more along the lines of eye candy versus actual quality. So I'm not a huge fan of naval on naval. I do like the amphibious assaults and the naval support aspects of the game. Not a fan of how naval versus naval engagements take place, and I think they may have been better off just treating it the way they do air engagements, where you only allow air units to support ground units. But anyway, this is not the review, so I don't want to get off into that too much. Again, you can check that out on wargamer.com. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please throw me a like. If you have any questions or concerns, please definitely don't hesitate. Give me a shout. Send me an email at the historicalgamer, just historicalgamer@gmail.com. Throw a question in the chat. If you didn't like it, dislike it. I'm not just plugging for likes. I want to know honestly what you think. This is only the 3rd video I've recorded with this microphone, so I hope things sound okay. I'm certainly still working on improving things. And I think I've walked around in a circle and beat a dead horse enough as it is, in terms of just kind of rambling out while I finish up this engagement here on the screen. Here's a hint. I'm going to win this battle. But this battle ends in a few moments here, and thanks again for watching, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer, and I am going to be signing out. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, peace.